That boy is cursed. He cannot speak because God has punished him. And now he brings a dying camel into our village. Throw them both into the desert where they belong. A mute orphan boy was mocked his entire life because he could not speak a single word. When he rescued a dying camel that a cruel merchant had abandoned in the desert, the village elders wanted them both gone. They said the boy was cursed and the camel was worthless. But when the worst drought in 100 years struck and every well ran dry, that dying camel led the silent boy to an underground spring that no one knew existed. The cursed boy and the worthless camel saved every life in the village. And when the boy finally spoke his first word, it brought an entire community to their knees. This is the story of a child who could not speak and an animal that could not be saved. Together, they proved that God's greatest miracles often come through those the world has rejected. In a remote desert village where the sun burned without mercy and the sand stretched endlessly toward the horizon, there lived a young boy named Ishmael. He was 12 years old, small for his age, with dark eyes that seemed to hold oceans of words that could never escape his lips. Ishmael had been born mute. Not a single sound had ever passed through his vocal cords. Not a cry when he entered the world. Not a laugh when something delighted him. Not a scream when pain touched his body. He lived in complete silence, trapped inside himself, unable to share his thoughts with anyone. The villagers had many theories about why Ishmael could not speak. Some said his mother had angered the spirits during pregnancy. Others claimed he was possessed by a demon that had stolen his voice. The cruelest among them whispered that God himself had cursed the boy, sealing his lips as punishment for some unknown sin. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Ishmael was treated as an outcast, a broken thing that didn't quite fit in the world of the speaking. Ishmael's parents had died when he was just 5 years old, taken by a fever that swept through the village during a particularly brutal summer. He had no siblings, no relatives willing to take him in, no one who wanted the burden of a silent child. The village elder, a stern man named Rashid, had reluctantly allowed Ishmael to live in a small mud hut at the edge of the village, surviving on whatever scraps the villagers chose to give him. It was charity given grudgingly, always accompanied by looks of pity or disgust. Elder Rashid was the most powerful man in the village. He controlled the wells, the trade routes, and the meager resources that kept the community alive. His word was law, and his judgments were final. He was not an evil man by nature, but decades of harsh desert life had hardened his heart. He believed in strength, in usefulness, in contribution. And in his eyes, Ishmael contributed nothing. A boy who could not speak, could not negotiate trades. He could not call for help during emergencies. He could not pray aloud or recite the sacred texts. He was, in Rashid's view, half a person at best. But Rashid's son, a young man named Malik, was far worse than his father. Where Rashid was merely cold, Malik was actively cruel. He was 20 years old, tall and strong, with a handsome face that hid an ugly soul. Malik had grown up knowing he would inherit his father's position, and this certainty had bred in him an arrogance that poisoned everything he touched. He treated the villagers like servants, and the servants like animals. And he treated Ishmael like less than either. Whenever Malik saw Ishmael in the village, he would find ways to torment him. He would knock food from the boy's hands and laugh as Ishmael scrambled to pick it up from the dirt. He would trip him in front of others and mock his inability to cry out. He would call him dumb one, cursed child, and worthless mute, always making sure others could hear, always reinforcing Ishmael's status as the lowest of the low. The other children followed Malik's example. They threw stones at Ishmael when adults weren't watching. They excluded him from games, saying, "What's the point of playing with someone who can't even call out the score?" They made up songs about the boy who swallowed his tongue and sang them loudly whenever he passed. Ishmael endured it all in silence, not because he had no feelings, but because he had no way to express them. Every insult, every stone, every cruel laugh was absorbed into his silent heart, stored away in a place where even he was afraid to look. But despite the cruelty of the world around him, Ishmael had not become cruel in return. Somewhere deep inside him, in a place untouched by the hatred of others, there remained a spark of extraordinary compassion. He could not speak, but he could feel equaled Lao, and he had learned to show kindness through actions, since words would forever be denied to him. Ishmael spent most of his days wandering the edges of the desert, far from the village where he was unwanted. He knew the dunes and the rocks, the hidden shade spots where small animals rested during the hottest hours, the places where desert flowers bloomed after rare rains. The desert was his friend in a way that humans never were. It did not judge his silence. It did not mock his inability to speak. It simply existed, vast and patient, asking nothing of him but his presence. It was during one of these wanderings that Ishmael found the camel. The sun was at its peak, blazing down with an intensity that made the air shimmer like water. Ishmael had walked farther than usual, following a dried riverbed that twisted through a rocky canyon. He was about to turn back when he saw something in the distance, a dark shape motionless against the golden sand. At first, he thought it was a rock, but as he drew closer, he realized it was something alive. Barely. It was a camel, collapsed on its side, its ribs visible through skin that seemed stretched too tight. Its eyes were half closed, glazed with dehydration and exhaustion. Foam had dried around its mouth, and its breathing was shallow, irregular, fading. Scattered around it were the remnants of a harness, ropes that had been cut, saddlebags that had been emptied and discarded. Someone had abandoned this animal here to die. Ishmael knelt beside the camel and placed his small hand on its neck. The skin was burning hot, fevered from the sun. The camel's eye rolled toward him, and in that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, connection. Two abandoned creatures, meeting in the vast emptiness of the desert, each seeing in the other a reflection of their own suffering. Most people would have walked away. The camel was clearly dying. Saving it would require effort, resources, time, and for what? A sick animal that probably wouldn't survive anyway. But Ishmael was not most people. He had been abandoned himself. He knew what it felt like to be left for dead by a world that considered him worthless, and he could not do to this creature what had been done to him. Ishmael ran back toward the village, his small legs pumping furiously across the hot sand. When he reached the communal well, he filled the leather pouch with water, ignoring the curious stares of the villagers. He grabbed a handful of dried dates from a basket near the market, not caring that he would probably be beaten for stealing later. And then he ran back to the dying camel in the canyon, back to the creature that needed him. He poured water into his hands and held it to the camel's cracked lips. At first, there was no response. But then, slowly, the camel's tongue, it lapped weakly at the precious liquid, each swallow a tiny victory against death. Ishmael gave it more and more, pacing himself so the animal wouldn't drink too fast and make itself sick. He mashed the dates into a paste and fed it to the camel piece by piece, watching as a spark of life began to return to those dulled eyes. For 3 days, Ishmael returned to the canyon every few hours. He brought water, food, and shade cloths stolen from the village. He slept beside the camel at night, keeping it warm when the desert temperature plummeted. He cleaned its wounds, removed the parasites that had begun to gather, and talked to it in the only way he could, through touch, through presence, through the silent language of kindness that needed no words. On the 4th day, the camel stood. It was shaky at first, legs trembling, body swaying, but it stood, and when it looked at Ishmael, there was something in its eyes that hadn't been there before. Trust, gratitude, a bond that would prove stronger than any rope or chain. Ishmael named the camel Sahia, which meant magical one in the old language. It was a name his mother had once whispered to him in a dream, though he couldn't be sure if the memory was real or imagined. Either way, it seemed to fit. There was something magical about this animal, something that Ishmael couldn't explain but could feel deep in his bones. When Ishmael finally led Sahir back to the village, the reaction was immediate and hostile. "What is this?" Malik shouted, striding toward them with fury in his eyes. "The mute brings a half-dead camel into our village." He grabbed Ishmael by the collar and shook him roughly. "Where did you steal this animal?" Ishmael couldn't answer, of course. He could only shake his head desperately, trying to communicate his innocence through his eyes. Elder Rashid emerged from his home, drawn by the commotion. He surveyed the scene with cold calculation. "That camel belongs to the merchant caravan that passed through last week." A sighed slowly. "They abandoned it because it was sick. They said it had the wasting disease and would infect other animals." Malik's eyes widened with fear and anger. He threw Ishmael to the ground. You brought a diseased animal into our village? Are you trying to kill us all? Ishmael scrambled to his feet, placing himself between Malik and Sahir. He spread his arms wide, shaking his head frantically. The camel wasn't diseased. He knew it. He had spent days with it, and there were no signs of sickness, only starvation and abuse. But no one was listening. The villagers had gathered now, and fear was spreading like wildfire. "Kill the camel!" someone shouted. "Drive them both out!" yelled another. A stone flew through the air and struck Ishmael on the shoulder. Then another. The crowd was turning into a mob. "Enough!" Rashid's voice cut through the chaos. The elder raised his hand, and the stones stopped flying. He walked slowly toward Ishmael and Sahia, his eyes examining the camel with a practiced gaze. After a long moment, he spoke again. "The animal does not appear diseased. It appears starved, which is different." Malik sputtered in protest. "But father," the merchant said. "Merchants lie to cover their cruelty," Rashid interrupted. "I have seen it before." He turned to look at Ishmael, and for a moment, something almost like respect flickered in his eyes. "You saved this animal, boy." Ishmael nodded. Rashid was silent for a long moment. "Tenisiget, you may keep it. But the camel is your responsibility. If it causes any trouble, if it shows any sign of disease, I will have it killed and you will be exiled. Do you understand?" Ishmael nodded again, relief flooding through his small body. Malik glared at him with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Moot," he hissed under his breath. Not by a long way. The months that followed were the happiest of Ishmael's young life. For the first time, he had a companion. Sahir followed him everywhere, sleeping outside his small hut at night, walking beside him during his desert wanderings. The camel had fully recovered, its ribs no longer visible, its coat thick and healthy. And there was something extraordinary about Sahir that Ishmael noticed right away. The camel seemed to understand him. When Ishmael was sad, Sahir would nuzzle against him, offering comfort without words. When Ishmael was hungry, Sahir would lead him to desert plants that were safe to eat, as if the animal knew things that no human had taught it. When danger approached, with a snake or scorpion or sandstorm, Sahir would alert Ishmael with a distinctive grunt that the boy had learned to recognize. They communicated in a language beyond speech, a language of the heart that needed no translation. But the happiness would not last. The drought came without warning. One week, the wells were producing as they always had. The next, they began to slow. And then, one by one, they ran dry. The underground springs that had sustained the village for generations simply stopped flowing, as if a giant hand had turned off a faucet somewhere deep beneath the earth. At first, there was denial. "The wells have gone dry before," the elder said. "They will refill." But days passed, then weeks, and no water came. The emergency reserves were depleted quickly. The animals began to die. The crops withered into dust, and the people began to look at each other with a fear that bordered on madness. Rashid sent parties in every direction, searching for water. They returned empty-handed, reporting that the drought extended for hundreds of miles. There was no oasis, no hidden spring, nothing that could save them. The village was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do. The mood turned ugly. Fear became anger, and anger sought a target. And who better to blame than the cursed boy and his magical camel? Malik led the accusations. The drought started after he brought that animal here. He shouted at a village meeting, "The mute has brought a curse upon us all. We must drive him out. Maybe then the rains will return." Voices rose in agreement. "The boy is bad luck," someone called. "He's always been cursed." Others nodded, their fear overwhelming their reason. When people are desperate, they look for someone to blame. And Ishmael, silent and defenseless, was the perfect scapegoat. Rashid listened to the arguments with a troubled expression. He did not believe in curses, not really, but he also knew that maintaining order required keeping the villagers calm, and if sacrificing one mute boy could prevent a riot. Before he could speak, Ishmael stepped forward. Every eye turned to him. The silent boy stood in the center of the gathering, his camel beside him, his face filled with a determination that seemed far beyond his years. He couldn't speak, but his eyes spoke volumes. He pointed to himself. Tenta Sair, then, to the horizon. He mimed, walking, searching, digging. His meaning was clear. He wanted to go into the desert to find water. Malik laughed cruelly. The mute wants to play hero. Let him go. He'll be dead within a day. And good riddance. Others murmured uncertainly. It was suicide. Surely. No one could find water in a drought this severe. Not experienced scouts. Not seasoned traders. Certainly not a 12-year-old boy who couldn't even call for help if he got lost. But Rashid looked at Ishmael differently. He saw something in the boy's eyes that he had not noticed before. Faith. Certainty. Conviction so strong that it bordered on the supernatural. Very well, Rashid said slowly. Go. Find water or don't return at all. Malik grinned, expecting to be rid of his tormentor forever. Ishmael simply nodded, turned, and walked into the desert with Sahir at his side. For 2 days, they wandered through a landscape that offered nothing but death. The sun beat down mercilessly. The sand burned through Ishmael's worn sandals. His water supply dwindled to nothing, and his lips cracked with thirst. But Sahir kept walking, kept moving, as if guided by something invisible. On the 3rd day, when Ishmael had nearly given up, Sahira stopped. They were in a rocky canyon that Ishmael had never seen before, far from any route the villagers used. The camel began pawing at the ground, snorting and grunting with unusual insistence. It would not move, would not be led away. It just kept digging, its massive hooves scraping against the sand and stone. Ishmael fell to his knees and began digging with his bare hands. His fingers bled as they scraped against rocks. His arms ached with exhaustion, but he kept digging, following Sahir's lead, trusting the animal that had never led him wrong. And then, 3 feet down, the sand became mud. Ishmael dug faster, his heart pounding. The mud became wet. And then, with a rush that seemed almost miraculous, water began to seep up from below. Not a trickle, but a flow. An underground spring, hidden for centuries beneath the desert floor, waiting for someone to find it. Ishmael fell back, laughing silently, tears of joy streaming down his face. Sahir drank deeply from the growing pool, then looked at Ishmael with what could only be described as satisfaction. They had done it. The cursed boy and the worthless camel had found water that generations of villagers had never known existed. The journey back to the village was difficult, but fueled by hope. Ishmael filled every container he had with water from the spring and led Sahir home, his small body somehow finding strength it shouldn't have had. When they arrived at the village, the sight that greeted them was one of despair. People lay in the shade of buildings, too weak to move. Children had stopped crying, too dehydrated for tears. The animals that remained were barely alive. It looked like the end of the world. But Ishmael walked into the center of the village and held up his containers of water. At first, no one believed it. Then Rashid stumbled forward, took one of the containers, and drank. His eyes widened. "It's fresh," he gasped. "Clean water. Where did you find this?" Ishmael pointed to the canyon, to Sahir, to the horizon. He mimed, digging, finding, flowing. And Rashid understood. Within hours, a party had followed Ishmael back to the spring. What they found exceeded their wildest hopes. The underground aquifer was massive, enough water to sustain the village for generations. The drought would still be hard, but they would survive. They would live. When they returned to the village with the news, the celebration was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. People wept with relief. Families embraced, and at the center of it all stood Ishmael and Sahir, the boy who couldn't speak and the camel everyone had wanted dead. Malik pushed through the crowd, his face twisted with a strange mix of emotions. He had tormented Ishmael for years, blamed him for the drought, called for his exile, and now this same boy had saved everyone, including Malik himself. For a long moment, Malik just stared at Ishmael. And then, slowly, he fell to his knees. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "About you. About everything. I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air like something holy. No one in the village had ever heard Malik apologize for anything. Not once. Not ever. Ishmael looked down at the man who had made his life a misery. He could have turned away, could have refused the apology, could have savored this moment of triumph. But that wasn't who Ishmael was. Instead, he reached out a small hand and placed it on Malik's shoulder. And then, something happened that no one expected. Ishmael opened his mouth, and for the first time in his 12 years of life, a sound emerged. It was just one word, one single word, whispered in a voice rusty from disuse, barely audible to those standing more than a few feet away. But it was a word that carried the weight of a lifetime of silence, a lifetime of pain, a lifetime of forgiveness that defied all reason. "Brother?" Malik's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. The entire village fell silent, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Ishmael smiled, a gentle, peaceful smile that seemed to light up the evening air. And then, stronger now, he spoke again. "We are all brothers, all sisters. We are family." The words flowed slowly, haltingly, like a river finding its course after years of being dammed. But they flowed. For reasons that no doctor could explain, the boy who had never spoken a word in his life was speaking now. Elder Rashid fell to his knees beside his son, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I saw you as less than whole. But you are more complete than any of us. You are blessed, not cursed. We were the ones who were blind." Ishmael placed his other hand on Rashid's shoulder. "Forgiven," he said simply. "All is forgiven." The village was transformed that night, not just by the discovery of water, but by the discovery of their own blindness. They had spent years mistreating a child who had more love in his silent heart than they had in all their speaking mouths combined. They had nearly driven away the very person who would save them all. In the weeks and months that followed, the village was rebuilt around the new spring. It became a place of pilgrimage, a place where people came from hundreds of miles away to see the miraculous water source and to hear the story of the mute boy and his magical camel. Some came for water, others came for hope, and everyone left, changed. Ishmael's voice never fully developed. He could speak simple words in short sentences, but long conversations remained beyond him. But that was enough. More than enough. He had spent 12 years communicating through actions, through love, through the silent language of the heart. Words were a bonus, not a necessity. Sahir lived for many more years, honored and beloved by the entire village. When the camel finally passed away, old and peaceful, and surrounded by those who loved him, the villagers built a monument at the spring, a statue of a camel and a boy, standing together, gazing out at the desert that had once tried to kill them both. The inscription read, "Here stood Ishmael, who could not speak, and Sahir, who was left to die. Together, they found water in the desert and taught a village to see. What the world calls worthless, God calls precious. What the world abandons, God redeems." Ishmael grew into a man of quiet wisdom, respected throughout the region as someone who understood things that educated scholars missed. People would travel great distances to sit with him, to ask his advice, to learn from his gentle presence. He never married, but he adopted dozens of orphan children over the years, giving them the love and acceptance that had been denied to him in his own childhood. And every evening, as the sun set over the desert, Ishmael would walk to the spring that Sahir had found. He would sit beside the water, watching the stars appear one by one, and he would whisper words that only the wind could hear. "Thank you," he would say. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for sending me Sahir. Thank you for turning my curse into a blessing." And somewhere in the vast expanse of the universe, it seemed that someone was listening. Because that's the truth this story reveals. God doesn't see the way we see. He doesn't value the things we value. The child the world calls cursed, he calls chosen. The animal the world calls worthless, he calls the instrument of salvation. The silence we see as weakness, he fills with purpose. And when we finally learn to see as he sees, to love as he loves, to value as he values, we find that the curses were blessings all along. We find that the rejected ones were the heroes waiting to be discovered. We find that the desert was never empty. It was full of miracles, waiting for someone humble enough to find them. Ishmael learned this truth through 12 years of silence. Sahir learned it through abandonment and near death. The village learned it through drought and desperation, but they all learned it eventually. And now, perhaps, you have learned it too. Because if you have ever felt voiceless, if you've ever felt worthless, if you've ever felt abandoned by a world that doesn't understand you, this story is for you. You are not cursed. You are not broken. You are not beyond redemption. You are exactly what the world needs. You just might not know it yet, but someday, when the drought comes and everyone is desperate, they will look to you, and you will lead them to water they never knew existed, and they will finally see what God saw all along, that the silent ones often have the most to say, that the rejected ones often have the most to give, and that every life, no matter how small or voiceless or forgotten, has the power to change the world. Friends, if this story touched your heart, drop a comment telling me what lesson it taught you. Let me know what country you're watching from. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this one. There's more waiting for you right on your screen. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.